I was like, so I snapped him with it, and he didn't answer the phone. And I'm like, yeah. I left it open, but then I said, like, I'm tired of it. I hope you guys are and it's like, his name is Sean. How do you know that? Sean. S-E-A-E. That is Sean. I know nobody named Sean.
You know the one whose name is
Oh, we got a new subscriber.
Cassidy. That man is so pretty. I was talking to
We got a new subscriber. My coworker.
but we need to go like.
Coworker Kaya. I told her about it. She's like, give me the channel. And I said, okay. She subscribed. It's crazy. Where did you get Sean from?
I don't know how to spell it. Oh! Okay, what else?
It's alright. It's a secret. But there's another guy that looks I know who he is, but then he didn't know who I was. That's the thing. People see me, but they don't know my name. Nobody knows who Aaron or my name is. They just see my face and they're like, oh, her. Yeah. So he was like, what do you look like? So I sent a picture of what I look like. He's like, I've seen you before. Somehow I've always wanted to tell you how beautiful you are. Something like that. You should have walked him from that second round. I was like, you know you don't have to lie to me, right? Like, it's okay. And he was like, but I'm not lying. Blah, blah, blah. And I was like, whatever. So he's, the rest of the break, he added me on like Thanksgiving or the Wednesday, and he just kept snapping me. And every once in a while he would say something and call me beautiful. And I was like, and he wanted to take me on a date. He wanted to go to the movies. He wanted to go ice skating. He also told me, he was like, he said something about reading, and I was like, oh yeah, I like to read, whatever. And he was like, do you read? No. Do you reread or like you used to read? And I was like, I sent him a picture of my bookshelf, and I was like, I was like, but it's kind of expensive. He was like, $200. I said, the other day I spent $100 on books. $200 wasn't there to spoil you. I'm a grown ass woman with a grown ass job. I can spoil myself. Yeah, you bought the KitchenAid. Yeah, but yeah. So you wanna know who it was? But you can't tell nobody else. Blur out my mouth. We're gonna. You can't know. But yeah, guys. So it's a really big. And guess who else acted? And once again said, what do you look like? But I knew who he was, but he didn't know who I was. He asked me, what you look like? It's like, oh, you go to Cecilia, or you used to? I said, yes, I go there now. Exactly. Mom trick. This a new Gavin. Oh, it's supposed to be like, you talking to drug dealers and shit? We did it because I think I'm not even talking about it. The one in the grade on the hoe. You know who I'm talking about? Cameron, I don't know. But him. We just snapping. And then follow, but then his account got banned. And then he followed me on Instagram. And we talk on Instagram. My Instagram, I can't keep going to Instagram. Who talks over Instagram? So then I kind of stopped replying to him. And then we just haven't talked since.
He made amazing cupcakes on the side.
So, we're going to start talking about covalent compounds.
But at the same time,
If you pay attention, you do the practice, this should be a fairly easy lesson which some of y'all can use.
he came to Russell's again. He came to Russell's one day,
I mean, it should
and
be
then
pretty
he came
easy.
to Russell's again.
But, I mean, there are a few things that can trip you
Happy
up.
Thanksgiving, I said boring.
Yes. Probably,
I'm not sure.
you're going to have a quiz on what we go over today on Wednesday. And then the test will be probably the beginning to middle of next week. There's not a whole lot to this section, and it is fairly easy.
Maybe I'll bring up my grade. I'm really bad at grade. I just want to bring it up.
This on Wednesday,
It's the only thing.
yes. And a test probably Tuesday, Wednesday. It's not a lot.
Oh,
Next Thursday.
We will after tomorrow, or maybe Wednesday, Thursday, have gone over all of the information for the test. It's basically what we're looking at, what we're going to go over today, and then it's going to be drawing Lewis diagrams. Or structures. This isn't, I need to have everybody quiet, which isn't overly difficult, but I'm going to give you a day or so to practice with that. Because that's where people tend to make a number of the mistakes in the test. Probably Tuesday, Wednesday, but it'll be another 2-day test. You'll have multiple choice one day, and a paper part the next. So, we're going to be talking about covalent compounds. The progress report you got today has everything in it except for the ed puzzle that y'all did at the end of, right before Thanksgiving.
If our class is split, how do we get ours? You get it tomorrow.
What do you mean split?
That's not here. Our teacher wasn't here this morning.
Okay.
So how do we get ours?
Oh, your progress reports?
is not that
Make it up
serious.
tomorrow.
You go on Student Progress Center and see.
You might be able to.
He's so
You
serious.
can try and see.
He's so
Have some Cassidy. Have some goldfish.
So, covalent compounds. So there's two kind of really big classifications of types of bonds you can have. Before Thanksgiving, we talked about ionic compounds. So if you remember, in an ionic compound, you had a metal that bonded to a nonmetal, correct? The metal lost the electron, the nonmetal gained the electron. The metal ended up with a positive charge, the nonmetal ended up with a negative charge, and that opposite, the attraction of the opposite charges is what held them together, correct? And they did that so that they could all have 8 valence electrons. Well, covalent bonds are a little bit different. They still form so that atoms can have 8 valence electrons, but what they do with how they, or what happens with the electrons is what's a little bit different. So in a covalent compound, you're going to have sharing of valence electrons. So, you might want to put off to the side right there too, that it's, in order to have a covalent bond, you have to have 2 shared valence electrons.
Two shared.
Right? So it takes 2 shared. So basically what happens is each element that's bonded together is going to share one of its valence electrons with the other. So each atom shares one electron with the other. So it takes 2 electrons to have a covalent bond. So the electrons are shared as well. Both atoms can claim those electrons.
It takes 2 electrons to what?
It takes 2, covalent bond takes 2 valence electrons. So each atom shares 1 valence electron with the other. Right? Another name for a covalent compound is a molecule. It's always going to be nonmetals that bond covalently. You're never going to have a metal bonded covalently. And then there are a few special elements that if they can't bond to another element, they're going to bond to another atom of themselves and go around as pairs. Those are called diatomic molecules. There are 7 of them, which are H, N, O, F, C, L, B, R, and I. And you need to have those memorized. All right, so I'll give you all a minute to catch up.
And can you read?
And then we'll kind of recap everything. You know I always go over it twice.
I didn't. You can have these. What is it? They swear the same. It's called. B. Yes, yeah.
What? You got it, or we need another minute?
Oh, this is you. Mom.
What's a little thing under the H? The little long?
Comma.
Oh, couldn't see.
It's still.
And these two, in a world where there's no real problems and everyone's happy, they can be together. Right?
All right?
Red is superior.
So,
Only remain pure.
in a covalent compound, or covalent bond, you're going to have the sharing of valence electrons. Each atom involved in the bond is going to share one of its valence electrons with the other. So that means in order to have a covalent bond, you have to have two shared valence electrons. Right? Another name for a compound that contains a covalent bond is a molecule. Right? Nonmetals are always going to be the elements that are involved in covalent bonds. So if you remember when we talked about ionic compounds, you always had a metal bonded to a nonmetal. Well, in a covalent compound, you're going to always have nonmetals bonded together. Metals never bond covalently. All right? So if I were to give you the choices Na, Mg, O, and Ne, and ask you which one of those would most likely bond covalently with nitrogen. So would it be Na, Mg, O, or Ne? Why?
In order to have a covalent bond, you must have two valence electrons.
It's a non-metal, but why is it O and not Ne?
Because
It's on this.
it's not
And Ne is a what? Noble gas.
Hey,
Alright, so remember, noble gases, even though they're nonmetals, aren't typically going to react with anything. So if I ask you a question like that, you'd find the nonmetal that's not a noble gas. Alright, so that's why it's O and not Ne. That makes sense? Noble gases aren't generally going to react, so they most likely won't form a covalent compound. So you look for the nonmetal that's not a noble gas. All right, and then you have 7 diatomic molecules. So these are molecule atoms that if they can't find another element to bond with, they're going to form a covalent bond with another atom in themselves and go around as a pair. All right, those 7 are H, N, F, Cl, Br, and O. You need to have those memorized. The easiest way you can tell if you look at the periodic table, you have H, so you have H, and then it makes a 7. So you start with N, O, F, Cl, Br, and O. So it's H, N, O, and then all of column 17 except for the last one. All right, so H, N, O, F, Cl, Br. All right, so make sure that you know those. All right, so any questions with this? All right. So now, there are kind of 2 categories of covalent bonds. You can have what's called a sigma bond, and you can have what's called a pi bond. A single covalent bond is referred to as a sigma bond. Then it's the weakest and the longest of the 2 types. Then, if you have 2 elements that have more than one covalent bond bonding them together, you have what's called a pi bond. So each additional pi bond increases the strength and shortens the distance between the atoms. So the more bonds you have between the 2 atoms, the stronger that bond is, and the closer together the atoms get.
together. But the red just tastes so good that it has to be pure. Because I would be one shitty goldfish if this is mixed with orange. Tell me that don't look like a tooth. Like, you want cheaper food?
Alright, you got it? So, I'll explain more about this slide when we look at the next one. It has a diagram that we'll look at. It'll make more sense when we talk about it in relationship to that diagram. So if we look at this diagram here, and you will see something similar to this on the quiz and the test. All right, each line that you see represents a covalent bond. So in this type of diagram, and we're actually going to look at how to draw these tomorrow and then later on in the week, each line that you see is a covalent bond. So this line represents how many electrons?
One.
Not one, two. Each line is always 2 electrons. What this means is, and what this line tells us, is this hydrogen is sharing one of its valence electrons with this carbon. This carbon is sharing one of its valence electrons with this hydrogen. So that's where you get the 2 valence electrons that are shared to make up the bond. That makes sense? So if you have one line, that would be a sigma bond, right? You can have 2 elements, though, that are held together with more than one covalent bond. So anytime you have more than one covalent bond, you have a pi bond. So for example, I have 2 lines between the 2 carbons, right?
Yep.
So those 2 lines represent a pi bond, all right? So if each line is 2 valence electrons, how many valence electrons are shared between the 2 carbons? 4. That makes sense? So one line represents 2 shared electrons. You can have up to 3 lines between. So if you have one line, it's a sigma bond. If you have more than one line, it's a pi bond. The more bonds you have between the 2 elements, the more strongly those 2 elements are held together, and the closer together they're going to be. Does that make sense? All right. So let's look at some of the questions I could ask you about this diagram. I could ask you some simple things like, how many sigma bonds are in this molecule? 4. So you just count how many one lines you have. So we have 4. How many pi bonds? 1. So you have one bond where you have more than one line. That makes sense? All right. Some other things I could ask you is, between carbon and hydrogen, which elements are held more strongly together? Carbon and carbon. So remember, the more lines you have, the stronger the bond. If I look at the carbon and the carbon, or the carbon and the hydrogens, which elements are further apart? Carbon and hydrogen. The more lines you have between them, the closer together the atoms. Does that make sense? You have kind of a funny look on your face. Get it?
No.
So each line represents a covalent bond. A covalent bond consists of two electrons.